In the middle of a brutal winter storm, a luxury SUV vanished on a frozen mountain road. Everyone assumed no one survived, but a retired Navy SEAL and his German Shepherd felt something was wrong and chose not to turn away. What they found wasn't just a wounded child, but a 10-year-old CEO carrying a secret that would shake an entire city. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Winter tightened its grip on the outskirts of Denver, where wind erased roads as fast as they formed, and the mountains watched in silence while steel and fate prepared to collide. Jack Walker drove because stillness was louder. The storm battered the windshield in blunt, relentless waves, turning the road into a pale ribbon that seemed to exist only because his headlights insisted it did. He kept both hands steady on the wheel, breathing slow and controlled, the way he had learned when panic meant death. Years ago, that discipline had saved lives. Now it was all that kept his thoughts from drifting into places he no longer trusted. Beside him, the German Shepherd sat upright, silent in a way that meant alert rather than calm. Jack didn't look at the dog. He didn't need to. He felt the tension through the space between them, through the air itself, the way he had once felt danger before it showed its face. Jack told himself he was only passing through these mountains, only driving because the night was long, and sleep came hard. It was the lie he used most often, and the one that worked just well enough to keep him moving. The uniform grounded him. Familiar fabric, familiar weight. It reminded Jack who he had been before the world narrowed into loss and memory. He had left the teams, left the missions, left the noise, but he had never escaped the part of himself that counted exits, measured risk, and searched constantly for what could go wrong. That part of him never slept. The wind screamed harder as the road curved along a rock face. Snow drifted sideways, erasing tracks as quickly as they appeared. Somewhere far below, the city lived its ordinary life, warm offices, lit windows, people who believed winter was an inconvenience instead of a threat. Jack's phone buzzed once in the console. No signal. He didn't bother checking. Then the dog shifted. Not a bark, not a growl. Just a subtle tightening, a change in posture that sent a quiet warning straight through Jack's spine. He eased off the gas without conscious thought, foot finding the brake with practiced care. "Yeah," he murmured, "I see it." The headlights swept across the snowbank and caught twisted metal where there shouldn't have been any. An SUV sat crooked against the stone, front end crushed inward as if it had tried to fold itself smaller. One door hung open, snow poured inside, burying glass and seats alike. The engine was dead and the silence that followed felt heavy, final. Jack stopped the truck and killed the engine. For a moment, he stayed where he was, suspended in that narrow space where decisions lived. He felt the familiar pull to keep driving, to tell himself someone else would come, someone closer, better equipped. He thought of all the times he had obeyed that instinct. The dog was already moving. Jack swore under his breath, pulled on his gloves, and stepped into the storm. Wind tore at his jacket, stealing heat with cruel efficiency. Snow creaked beneath his boots as he approached the wreck. The driver was still behind the wheel, and Jack knew before he checked. He checked anyway. No pulse, no warmth. Just the quiet certainty of a life ended too fast. Jack exhaled slowly. One down. He hated that his mind still used that language. The dog didn't linger. It moved past the SUV, nose low, cutting through the snow with purpose. Jack followed, heart picking up speed despite his effort to keep it steady. 10 yards from the crash, half buried beneath fresh snowfall, lay a small shape. Jack's breath caught. She was a child. Not unconscious in the way adults sometimes were. This was different, smaller, more fragile. Her body lay twisted at a wrong angle, dark hair stiffening at the edges where snow clung. Blood stained the white ground beneath her head, painfully bright. "Hey," Jack said softly as he dropped to his knees. "Hey, stay with me." He checked her airway, movements controlled despite the surge of something sharp and dangerous in his chest. She was breathing, shallow and uneven. Her skin was ice cold. Hypothermia, severe trauma, time slipping away. The dog pressed close without being told, sharing warmth, steady and unflinching. Jack scanned the road. No lights, no sound beyond wind and the mountain shifting under snow. He made the decision before his mind could argue. He lifted the girl carefully, ignoring the protest in his shoulders as pain flared and settled. She was lighter than she should have been. Too light. He adjusted his grip to protect her head and turned back toward the truck. The storm seemed to worsen, offended by his defiance. By the time he reached the cabin, her breathing had weakened, her body trembling in violent shivers. Jack forced the door open and carried her inside. The smell of old wood and cold ash wrapped around them like a memory he hadn't invited. The cabin was dark but solid. It held. It always had. Jack moved with practiced efficiency. Fire, blankets, emergency supplies he had never stopped carrying despite telling himself that life was over. The dog took position near the door, guarding without ceremony. Jack cut away frozen fabric, hands steady, even as anger burned beneath his ribs. Her leg was badly injured, swollen, and bent at a wrong angle. He stabilized it as best he could, working through pain he would deal with later, not now. "Don't do this," he muttered, unsure who he was speaking to. "Don't you quit on me." The fire caught. Heat bloomed slowly. Jack layered blankets, pressed warmth back into her hands and feet, spoke to her in the calm voice he had learned to use when chaos threatened to take over. "You're okay, I've got you." Hours blurred together. The storm surged and receded. Jack fed the fire, checked her pulse, counted breaths. Memory tried to intrude, other bodies, other nights, but he pushed it aside. There would be time for that later, if later came. Just before dawn, her breathing steadied. Jack sagged back against the wall, exhaustion finally clawing its way in. The dog shifted closer, a quiet presence at his side. Jack didn't sleep. When the girl stirred, it was subtle, a tightening of fingers, a shallow gasp. Jack was on his feet instantly. "Easy," he said gently. "Don't move." Her eyes fluttered open, fear flashing briefly before calculation replaced it. She swallowed hard. "My driver," she whispered. Jack hesitated, then told the truth. He didn't make it. She closed her eyes for a moment, looking suddenly very young. When she opened them again, her voice was steadier. "My name is—" She stopped, then continued. "I'm the CEO of Hartwell Dynamics. I was on my way to sign an emergency contract." Jack stared at her. A child. A leader. A storm still raging outside. He understood then that saving her life had only been the beginning. Morning light struggled through frost-covered windows as the storm loosened its grip, leaving the mountains suspended between silence and aftermath, where survival had replaced urgency, but certainty was still far away. Jack Walker noticed the quiet first, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that followed violence when the world paused as if waiting to see who would move next. The fire had burned down to a steady core of embers, enough to keep the cabin alive, but not warm enough to relax his vigilance. He sat on the edge of a wooden chair, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the slow rise and fall of the girl's chest. Every breath she took felt borrowed. He counted them without meaning to, the way he had counted heartbeats in other places, other winters, when dawn had felt just as uncertain. The German shepherd remained near the door, alert without tension, carrying the quiet confidence of something that understood its role, had not ended simply because the immediate danger had passed. Jack felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, heavier than exhaustion, heavier than fear. Responsibility had a sound to it, he had learned. It sounded like silence demanding an answer. The girl slept unevenly, drifting in and out, her body fighting its own private war. Jack monitored her the way he once monitored teammates, not with hope, but with discipline. He checked circulation, adjusted the splint, pressed warmth back where it tried to escape. Her leg worried him most. The swelling had increased despite his care, and he knew enough to understand what that meant. The mountain had bought her time, but it had also trapped them both. He thought of evacuation routes, response windows, probabilities that narrowed with every hour. None of them favored a child with severe injuries and no access to proper care. He pushed the thought aside and focused on what was in front of him, because thinking too far ahead had ruined men before. At some point the girl stirred again, more aware this time. Her eyes opened slowly, not with panic but with effort, as if waking itself required negotiation. Jack stayed still, letting her orient herself. He remembered being taught that control was often restored not by force, but by allowing someone the dignity of understanding where they were. She swallowed and winced, a small sound escaping her despite her attempt to contain it. Jack felt something tighten in his jaw. Pain like that was never small, no matter who carried it. "You're still safe," he said quietly. "Storm's easing. You did good." She studied him for a moment, not as a frightened child might, but with the sharp searching look of someone used to rooms where decisions were made quickly and mistakes were expensive. It unsettled him more than fear would have. She asked about her driver again. Jack answered again. Truth did not change when repeated, but sometimes it needed reinforcement to be believed. This time, her reaction was different. She nodded once, eyes closing, absorbing the loss without theatrics. Jack wondered what kind of childhood taught someone to grieve that way. He did not ask. He had learned that some questions were invitations people were not ready to accept. Instead, he offered water, carefully, drop by drop, and watched relief flicker briefly across her face when her body accepted it. Hours passed with the slow, grinding patience of winter. Outside, the wind faded to a distant murmur. The road would still be closed. Help would still be delayed. Jack moved through the cabin, inventorying supplies, calculating how long he could keep her stable. He had planned this place as a temporary refuge for himself, never imagining it would become something else. He felt a bitter edge of irony at that. He had spent years avoiding responsibility after leaving the service, convincing himself that stepping back was the same as making peace. Yet here it was again, heavier than before, impossible to set down. When the girl finally spoke more than a few words at a time, she did so with precision. She explained who she was, not with pride, but with necessity, as if identity were another medical fact Jack needed to know. CEO, interim authority, contracts waiting, deadlines that would not pause for storms or injuries. Jack listened without interrupting, but inside something shifted. He had expected fear, confusion, maybe anger. What he found instead was pressure, immense and misaligned, resting on shoulders far too young to have chosen it. He thought of command decisions made under fire, of responsibility handed down without consent, and recognized the same strain in her voice. The mountain did not care who you were, he thought, but the world did, and it expected results regardless of cost. The German shepherd rose and moved closer to the girl as her voice faltered, responding to something Jack could not hear. The dog's presence steadied her breathing, and Jack felt a flicker of gratitude he did not fully understand. He had trusted this animal with his life more than once, and seeing that trust extend beyond him felt strangely disarming. Loyalty, he realized, was not something you owned. It was something you witnessed. By midday, the swelling in her leg worsened. Jack adjusted the splint again, knowing it was a temporary solution at best. He could feel frustration building beneath his calm, a low burn fueled by the limits of what he could do. In the teams, limits were negotiated with resources and backup. Here, there was only judgment and endurance. He stepped outside briefly to check the road, the cold biting into his lungs as he scanned the white expanse below. No movement, no sound, just the vast indifference of the mountain. For the first time since the rescue, doubt crept in, not about stopping, but about whether stopping would be enough. When he returned inside, the girl was watching him. "You could have left," she said quietly. It was not an accusation, it was a statement. Jack considered the answer. Many came to mind, none of them comfortable. "I didn't," he said finally. It was the simplest truth he had. She nodded again, as if filing the information away for later use. Jack wondered what she would do with it, how it would shape whatever decisions waited beyond this cabin. He felt a strange, protective urgency, not just for her safety, but for what she might become if this moment went the wrong way. As evening approached, the cabin grew colder despite the fire. Jack prepared what little food he had, offering it carefully. She ate sparingly, conserving energy, every movement deliberate. Watching her, Jack felt a familiar ache, one he usually kept buried. He had seen children in war zones forced to grow older than their years, had watched the cost accumulate in their eyes. He had sworn once, silently, that he would not be part of that equation again. Yet here he was, standing at the intersection of chance and consequence, unable to pretend neutrality was an option. Night settled early. The storm did not return, but its absence brought no comfort. Jack took the first watch without deciding to, sitting near the fire, listening to the steady rhythm of two beings he had chosen to protect. The dog rested nearby, alert even in stillness, carrying the memory of training and loss. Jack had never fully shaken himself. The cabin creaked softly as the temperature dropped, and Jack felt the weight of the coming days press in. Somewhere beyond the mountain, questions were forming. Investigations, responsibility, names that would eventually be spoken aloud. He did not know how any of it would end. He only knew that when morning came, this would no longer be just a rescue. It would be a reckoning, and he was already part of it. The storm finally released the mountain, leaving the cabin suspended in a brittle calm, where daylight returned without warmth, and survival gave way to questions that refused to stay buried. Jack Walker woke before the girl this time, not because he had slept, but because habit no longer recognized the difference between night and morning. The fire had dwindled to embers again, and the cabin carried the hollow quiet of a place that had finished its emergency and now waited for consequences. He moved slowly, careful not to wake her, listening to the subtle sounds that told him she was still alive, still fighting. Each breath steadied him and unsettled him at the same time. In combat, uncertainty had always been external. Here, it lived inside his chest. When she opened her eyes, there was no panic. That alone struck him harder than any cry could have. She studied the ceiling, the light, the walls, then turned her gaze toward him as if orienting herself in a boardroom rather than a mountain cabin. Jack felt a flicker of unease he didn't immediately recognize. He realized it was respect, edged with worry. Children were not supposed to look at the world like that. She asked how long she had been unconscious. Jack answered. She asked about the road conditions. Jack answered. She asked if anyone knew where she was. That one gave him pause. He told her the truth, that communication was still unreliable, that people would be looking, that storms delayed answers but didn't erase them. She absorbed each word without interruption, her face tightening not with fear but calculation. Jack had seen that expression before, on commanders deciding who moved first and who waited. It sat wrong on her. It was she who insisted on speaking clearly, on explaining fully. Not because she wanted sympathy, but because she believed information mattered. She gave her name, her title, her authority, and the reason she had been traveling through a place no child should have been during winter. Jack listened, his thoughts pulling in two directions at once. Part of him reacted as a soldier would, registering the implications, the attention that would follow, the scrutiny that would eventually find its way up this mountain. Another part reacted as something he rarely acknowledged, a man who understood too well what it meant to be assigned a role before you were ready to carry it. When she finished, the silence stretched. Jack became acutely aware of the dog's presence, the quiet steadiness near the door, as if it sensed the shift in weight within the room. Jack realized that in saving her, he had disrupted more than a single night's outcome. He had placed himself between a child and the machinery of a world that would not slow down for injury or age. The thought unsettled him in a way gunfire never had. "You shouldn't have been on that road," he said finally, not as judgment, but as fact. She met his gaze evenly. "I shouldn't have been needed," she replied. The words landed with a force that surprised him. He heard echoes of briefings long past, of decisions justified by necessity rather than wisdom. He wondered who had taught her that lesson and at what cost. As the morning wore on, Jack helped her sit up for brief moments, watching carefully for signs of shock or worsening pain. Each movement was deliberate, each breath measured. He admired her restraint, even as it troubled him. Pain had a way of stripping people down to what they were. What it revealed in her felt too sharp, too composed. He found himself speaking more than he intended, explaining small things about the cabin, the mountain, the weather, as if anchoring her to simpler truths might offer balance. He wasn't sure when that instinct had taken root. At one point she asked about him, not his name, which she already knew, but why he had been there at all. Jack considered deflecting. He considered lying. Instead, he told her a version of the truth, that he drove when sleep became difficult, that mountains made more sense to him than cities, that sometimes being alone felt safer than being needed. He did not mention the faces that followed him into dreams or the decisions he still replayed in the dark. He saw understanding flicker in her eyes anyway, quiet and unsettling. The dog shifted closer as the day grew colder, positioning itself in a way that blocked drafts and distraction alike. Jack felt a subtle reassurance in that, a reminder that not all burdens were his alone. Still, the weight of the situation pressed in. He thought about what would happen when the road reopened, when officials arrived, when questions were asked. He imagined the girl standing in front of microphones, small and composed, absorbing blame that did not belong to her. The image sparked something protective and dangerous inside him. As afternoon light faded, she rested again, exhaustion finally claiming its due. Jack sat nearby watching the fire, listening to the mountain breathe. He felt the edge of something forming, a sense that this place, this rescue, was not accidental in the way accidents usually were. He did not believe in fate, but he believed in patterns, and this one felt unfinished. When she stirred once more, murmuring something about schedules and signatures, Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Whatever waited beyond this cabin, he knew it would reach back here, and when it did, the ground beneath them would matter more than anyone realized. The mountain lay exposed beneath a pale winter sky, the storm gone, but its consequences frozen into the land, while the cabin held 2 survivors and a truth waiting to be uncovered. Jack Walker noticed the change in her before she spoke. It wasn't fear or pain this time, but a quiet urgency that tightened the air in the cabin. She asked for the files with a calm that felt rehearsed, the kind of calm people used when they already suspected the answer, but needed confirmation to survive it. Jack hesitated only a second before handing over the tablet and documents he had salvaged from the vehicle, dried carefully near the fire. He told himself it was practical. That information belonged to her as much as bandages and water did, but something in his chest warned him this moment carried weight he could not lift for her. She worked slowly, deliberately, scrolling through reports, safety assessments, and archived approvals related to the region. Jack watched from a distance, pretending to busy himself with the fire, though every muscle in his body stayed tuned to her breathing, the smallest changes in posture. He recognized the look on her face as the same one he had seen in after-action reviews, when Data stopped being abstract and started naming the dead. It was the look of someone bracing for impact without armor. When she stopped scrolling, the cabin seemed to shrink. She stared at a single line on the screen longer than necessary, then read it again, as if repetition might change meaning. Jack felt a familiar tightening behind his ribs. He didn't ask what she had found. He waited, because he knew some truths needed space to speak on their own. "My father signed this," she said at last. Her voice did not shake. That frightened him more than if it had. She turned the screen slightly, not for explanation, but acknowledgement. The approval dated years back, the designation clear, risk assessed as low, maintenance deferred. Jack absorbed it in silence. The name meant nothing to him, but the implication landed hard. This place, this road, this accident were not the result of neglect alone. They were the echo of a decision made by someone who had believed, or needed to believe, that the margins would hold. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jack felt anger rise, sharp and instinctive, then settle into something heavier. He had learned long ago that blame was easy and rarely useful. What mattered was what came after. He watched the girl process the weight of inheritance in real time, not of wealth or authority, but of consequence. She was too young for that kind of reckoning, and yet it had found her anyway. He thought he was doing the right thing, she said, more to herself than to Jack. It wasn't a defense. It was an attempt at understanding. Jack nodded once. He had known many good men who made decisions that aged badly, decisions that survived them and harmed others in quieter ways. The mountain did not care about intent. It only responded to physics and weather and time. She closed the file carefully, as if roughness might break something irreparable. Jack saw her hands tighten briefly, then relax. Control reasserted itself, thin but present. He wondered how many times she had watched adults around her do the same thing, absorb shock and move forward without permission to fall apart. He felt an urge to tell her she didn't have to carry this alone, but the words felt inadequate. Protection, he knew, was rarely about what you said. It was about what you stood between. The dog shifted closer, sensing the change without understanding its cause. Jack felt a flicker of gratitude for that uncomplicated loyalty. He had trusted this animal in places where trust was a gamble, and it had never failed him. Watching it now, calm and steady, he felt the echo of past missions where silence meant survival. This was different, but the instinct was the same. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Jack recognized the question as more than logistical. It was about identity, about whether she was bound to repeat a path laid down before she had any say in it. He considered his answer carefully. "That depends," he said, "on what you choose to do with what you know." It was not comfort, it was honesty. She nodded slowly, absorbing the implication. Knowledge did not absolve. It demanded action. As the day wore on, the reality of their isolation pressed back in. Roads would open soon, but not yet. Jack checked the radio again, catching fragments of distant communication, enough to confirm that attention was moving in their direction. He imagined the arrival of officials, questions layered with expectation and judgment. He imagined cameras. He imagined the girl standing before them, small and composed, expected to answer for a legacy she had not created. The thought stirred something fierce in him. He had walked point for men before. He could do it again. When she rested, exhaustion finally pulling her under, Jack stepped outside and looked down the mountain. The road glinted faintly, a scar through white. He thought about decisions made in offices far from here, decisions that reduced places like this to lines on a map. He thought about the cost of those abstractions. He also thought about his own past, about the times he had trusted orders that felt wrong and paid for it later. responsibility, he knew, was not inherited cleanly. It seeped through generations unless someone chose to stop it. As evening approached, Jack prepared for the next phase without naming it. He inventoried supplies again, checked exits, planned routes, not because he expected another storm, but because confrontation took many forms. Inside, the girl slept fitfully, murmuring once, a name Jack suspected was her father's. The sound cut deeper than he expected. He understood then that whatever came next would not be about reports or signatures alone. It would be about a child facing the shadow of a man she had loved, and a soldier deciding how much of his own past he was willing to bring forward to shield her. When night settled over the cabin, Jack took his place near the door, senses sharp, knowing that truth, once uncovered, never stayed contained for long. The city answered the mountain with noise instead of wind, where winter still clung to streets and rooftops, and truth stepped into the open, carrying a child, a soldier, and consequences that refused to stay contained. Jack Walker felt the shift the moment they descended from the mountain. It wasn't in the weather or the traffic, but in the air itself, heavier and charged, the way it had felt before operations went sideways. The girl sat beside him, bundled and silent, her injury carefully stabilized, her gaze fixed forward, as if looking back might fracture something already strained too thin. Jack kept his focus on the road, aware of every vehicle that lingered too long, every sudden movement in the corners of his vision. The German shepherd sensed it too, a familiar tightening of purpose that carried echoes of training and hard memory, the understanding that danger here would not announce itself cleanly. They did not go straight to a hospital. Protocol demanded otherwise, but Jack understood the calculus better than most. Information had already leaked. A child CEO injured in a remote crash, a deceased driver, a storm, a delayed response. The story had grown teeth while they were still above the tree line. By the time they reached the secured entrance of a private medical facility, cameras were already clustered beyond the barriers, voices rising and overlapping, each demanding a piece of something they did not fully understand. Jack positioned himself instinctively, one step ahead and half a turn to the side, placing his body where it needed to be without ceremony. Protection, he knew, was often invisible until it failed. The girl was moved inside, and for a brief stretch of hours, the world narrowed again to monitors, controlled lighting, and the measured cadence of medical certainty. Jack waited, standing instead of sitting, counting minutes he did not need to count. He felt the old impatience surface, the urge to act when action was no longer his to take. The dog remained at his side, quiet, alert, its presence a grounding force that reminded him this was still real, still happening. When the doctors emerged, their assessment was cautious but stable. Surgery would wait. Observation would not. Jack nodded, absorbing the information without comment, his relief restrained by habit. It did not last. By the time the girl was cleared for limited public appearance, the narrative had hardened. Outside the facility, anger had replaced curiosity. Jack watched it gather through glass and distance, saw how easily grief and confusion twisted into accusation. Some shouted her name, others shouted her father's. Words like blood and blame surfaced, raw and unfiltered. Jack felt something cold settle behind his eyes. He had seen crowds like this before, different uniforms, same hunger. A need for an enemy, simple enough to hold. When they moved her, it happened fast. A controlled exit, coordinated steps, a corridor of security that felt thinner than it should have been. Jack stayed close, his awareness expanding outward, mapping threats the way he always had. He caught the first thrown object before it reached her, felt the impact jar his arm, and ignite a familiar, dangerous calm. The dog reacted instantly, not with chaos, but with a presence that demanded space, a low warning that cut through the noise with unmistakable intent. The crowd surged anyway. Someone broke through the line. Then another. Jack did not think. He shifted, placed himself fully between the girl and the press of bodies, one hand braced, the other guiding her backward. He heard her gasp, felt her grip tighten on his sleeve, a silent request he answered without words. He moved them laterally, toward cover, away from the densest pressure, using angles and momentum rather than force. The dog mirrored him, creating a moving boundary that people hesitated to cross. Fear, Jack knew, was still a language most understood. A bottle shattered against the pavement. Shouts turned sharper, uglier. Jack registered faces without memorizing them, assessed intent in fractions of seconds. He thought of other evacuations, other protectees, and how quickly things went wrong when hesitation crept in. He felt the girl's weight shift as pain flared through her injured leg and anger burned hot and focused in his chest. Not rage, clarity. This was his line. No one crossed it. Security finally surged forward, reinforcements arriving late but decisive. The corridor tightened. The noise receded, replaced by controlled movement and shouted commands that pulled the situation back from collapse. Jack kept moving until steel doors closed behind them, sealing out the crowd and its hunger. Only then did he stop. The girl's breathing was shallow but steady. She looked up at him, eyes bright with something he recognized too well, the aftermath of adrenaline, the realization of how close things had come. "I didn't expect that," she said quietly. Jack met her gaze. "I did," he replied, not unkindly. He did not tell her why. Some knowledge, he knew, arrived too early to be useful. Later, in a quieter room, she addressed the cameras on her own terms. Jack stood just out of frame, close enough to intervene, far enough to let her speak. She did not deflect. She did not deny. She acknowledged the report, her father's signature, the system that had allowed risk to be misnamed and delayed. Her voice did not waver, though Jack could see the effort it took. He felt a surge of something like pride and a heavier weight of concern. Speaking truth did not end conflict. It invited it. When it was over, when the lights dimmed and the doors closed, Jack remained. He could have stepped away then. His role, strictly speaking, was finished. But he stayed because he understood what came next. Anger did not vanish when confronted with honesty. It changed shape. The dog settled near the door, alert but calm, as if accepting this new perimeter as its own. Jack looked at the girl sitting small and composed on the edge of a bed too large for her, and understood that the storm they had escaped was simpler than the one now forming. This was not a mountain problem. This was a human one. And unlike the weather, it would not pass on its own. As night fell, reports continued to cycle across screens in distant rooms. Investigations were announced. Opinions hardened. Jack felt the familiar tension of a mission expanding beyond its original scope. He did not know how long he would stay or how far this would go. He only knew that leaving now would mean abandoning something unfinished. He rested a hand briefly on the dog's shoulder, drawing quiet resolve from the contact, and made a decision without ceremony. Whatever came next, he would not let her face it alone. Winter lingered over the city in muted tones, no longer violent, but unyielding, as investigations replaced outrage and responsibility began to demand structure instead of slogans. Jack Walker learned quickly that silence could be louder than a crowd. After the cameras pulled back and the most volatile voices burned themselves out, what remained was pressure without shape, questions without faces, and a steady tightening around the girl's life that felt more dangerous than open hostility. He stayed close, not because anyone asked him to, but because absence would have been noticed, and he had no intention of teaching the world that she was ever unguarded. The city moved on schedules and statements now, committees forming, reviews announced, language polished, until it dulled the edges of what had happened. Jack listened from the margins, hearing what was said and what was carefully avoided, recognizing the familiar gap between intention and execution. The girl recovered slowly. Pain was managed, mobility restricted, but her mind remained sharp, restless. Jack saw it in the way she asked for updates, in the way she followed developments beyond what doctors recommended. He understood the impulse. Inaction could feel like failure to people wired for responsibility. He spoke to her when it mattered, not to advise, but to ground. He reminded her of limits, of timelines dictated by bodies rather than boards. Sometimes she listened, sometimes she didn't. He did not push. He had learned the hard way that control was rarely surrendered by force. Meetings replaced press conferences. Independent inspectors arrived, not as saviors, but as witnesses. Jack attended when invited and lingered when not, offering context that maps and reports lacked. He spoke of the road as it behaved in winter, of wind patterns that turned ice invisible, of margins that collapsed under real conditions. He kept his language precise, unemotional. Facts landed harder that way. The dog accompanied him when allowed, a quiet constant that seemed to ease tension without explanation. Jack noticed how often people deferred to its presence, how instinct still cut through protocol when reason stalled. The girl participated when her health allowed, speaking less, but listening more. Jack watched her absorb the weight of testimony, saw the moment when theory gave way to consequence. It reminded him of young officers he had once mentored, brilliant and untested, learning that command was less about authority than endurance. He felt an unexpected kinship, and with it, a sharpened sense of duty. This was not mentorship by choice, but by circumstance, and that made it more fragile. Resistance surfaced predictably, costs were cited, timelines questioned. Risk reclassified in language Jack recognized as evasion. He did not argue ideology. He pointed instead to specifics, to places where assumptions failed. The girl backed him when it mattered, not with volume, but with resolve. Together, they disrupted a process designed to outlast accountability. Jack felt the old rhythm return, the sense of a mission taking form, not with orders, but with alignment. It unsettled him how natural it felt. Outside the rooms where decisions were made, the city reacted in quieter ways. Messages arrived, some grateful, some threatening, many confused. Jack filtered what reached her, not to shield her from reality, but to give it shape she could withstand. He remembered too well what it meant to be flooded with everything at once. Protection, he decided, was as much about pacing as presence. As weeks passed, the narrative shifted. Less spectacle, more substance. Recommendations turned into directives. Funding was rerouted. Temporary measures became plans. Jack watched the girl change with it, not hardening, but settling into something steadier. He wondered how much of that stability came from knowing she was not standing alone. He did not ask. Some truths worked best unspoken. One evening, as snow fell lightly outside a government building stripped of ceremony, the girl looked at him and asked a question he had been avoiding. "What happens when this is over?" she said. Jack did not answer immediately. He thought about the life he had been living before the mountain, about movement without destination. He thought about the road that had led him here. "Over is relative," he said finally. It was the most honest answer he had. The dog settled at his feet, calm, present, as if confirming the decision Jack had not yet named. He felt it then, the quiet certainty beneath the noise. This work was not temporary. It was a continuation, different terrain, same principles. As the city lights reflected off fresh snow and plans moved from paper toward ground, Jack understood that the rescue had evolved into something more demanding and more necessary. The storm had passed, but the work had only begun. Winter loosened its final hold on the city, leaving streets wet with thaw and memory, while the mountain receded into distance and the work born there reached its moment of reckoning. Jack Walker stood at the edge of the temporary operations center as the final review concluded, listening to language sharpen into decisions that would outlast any headline. The weeks since the confrontation had compressed time, each day carrying the weight of months, and he felt it now in the quiet after agreement, the peculiar stillness that followed completion rather than relief. The girl sat across the room with her legs supported, attentive and composed, no longer the center of a storm, but the steady axis around which change had aligned. Jack watched her sign the last document with care that bordered on reverence, understanding that this signature differed from those that had come before, not in authority, but in accountability, and he felt an unfamiliar ease settle where vigilance had lived. The dog remained nearby, calm and present, sensing the release without confusion, the instinct that danger had receded enough to allow stillness without surrender. When the officials departed and the room emptied, Jack did not rush to fill the silence. He had learned that endings needed space to breathe. The girl broke it first, asking whether the mountain road would be reopened under the new standards. Jack nodded, picturing the survey lines, the shelters installed where none had existed, the early warnings now calibrated to winter rather than spreadsheets. He answered with facts, but what he felt was gratitude tempered by grief, an acknowledgement that prevention arrived too late for some and just in time for others. Later, they returned together to the cabin, not as survivors, but as witnesses to what had been set in motion. The climb felt different, less urgent, and Jack noticed the absence of the constant scan, the way his shoulders lowered without conscious permission. The cabin greeted them with its familiar solidity, no longer a refuge by necessity, but a place made purposeful by choice. Inside, the logbook lay open on the table, new entries recorded in careful handwriting, noting dates, conditions, and names of those who had passed through since the changes began. Jack added one more line, concise and exact, marking the transition from emergency to stewardship, and closed the book with a sense of finality that surprised him. As daylight faded, they sat near the fire, not speaking much, the quiet between them earned rather than strained. The girl asked him then what he would do next, and Jack considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He thought of the years spent moving without direction, of nights driven through snow because motion felt safer than rest, of a life defined by reaction rather than intention. He answered that he would stay, not because he was needed in the way he once had been, but because presence mattered when systems changed and people learned new habits. She nodded, satisfied not because the answer solved anything, but because it was chosen. The dog shifted closer to the hearth, content, carrying the echo of training fulfilled not by command, but by purpose, and Jack felt a quiet pride he did not need to name. In the days that followed, the work continued without spectacle. Inspections concluded, shelters stocked, protocols revised with local knowledge embedded rather than appended. Jack trained teams to read winter honestly, to listen to the land, to respect margins that vanished under ice, and he did it without rank or ceremony, finding that leadership returned to him when he stopped reaching for it. The girl visited when her recovery allowed, listening more than speaking, asking questions that cut to practice rather than policy, learning to weigh risk not as an abstraction, but as a human cost. When spring finally edged the snow back into shadow, they stood on the porch of the cabin and watched meltwater trace new paths, proof that terrain remembered what people tried to forget. Jack felt the old ache of loss stir and settle, the memory of choices that could not be rewritten, and he accepted it without flinching. He understood then that closure was not an ending, but a commitment to carry what mattered forward, without pretending it could be made clean. As the season turned, Jack packed the uniform away, not as a rejection, but as a sign that its work had changed, and he stepped into the role he had chosen with the same steadiness that had once carried him through worse nights. The girl departed with a promise not spoken aloud, but honored in action, and the road below glinted with new markers that caught the light early, warning rather than inviting. Jack remained at the cabin as evening settled, the dog at his side, the fire low and steady, and for the first time in years he did not feel the need to drive through the night. The work was here, the purpose clear, and winter, when it returned, would find the mountain watched and the people ready, not because storms could be controlled, but because responsibility had been accepted and kept. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as thunder from the sky or fire in the night. Sometimes they come quietly, wrapped in difficult choices, in hands that refuse to turn away, in courage that stands firm when fear would be easier. God does not always stop the storm, but He places light within it, a person, a moment, a decision that changes the path of many lives. In our daily lives, we carry the same crossroads as Jack did. Messages we read, but delay answering. People we mean to help tomorrow. Truths we know but hesitate to face. This story reminds us that tomorrow is never guaranteed, but love, responsibility, and faith are always available right now. When we choose to act with integrity, even in small ways, we may become the miracle someone else is praying for. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Your voice matters more than you know. And if you believe in stories that heal, inspire, and remind us we are never alone, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue this journey together. May God bless you and your loved ones, guard you on every road you travel, and place quiet miracles in your life exactly when you need them most.